All right, guys, welcome to a special episode of, I think I'm going to call this the Confidant Podcast just because,
I think confidence better because you have a whole side.
Yeah, right. It's like, not called the Confidant Podcast. Why? Because we have important people that I consider confidants in my life that I speak to about.
First take.
Yeah, definitely. They don't know that we had a first date. Anyways, we're bringing to you guys, I think, a breaking announcement in the real estate space. If you're in the real estate space, that you've probably also heard about the NAR lawsuit and what's going on and transpiring in the real estate world, which is going to take effect, if I'm not mistaken, in July of this year. So in a few short months, the real estate landscape as we know is going to change. And there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of questions being asked. And to be honest, not everybody has the answers because it hasn't started yet. We haven't seen it. But to kind of help alleviate some of those questions and to bring more clarity, we decided to bring on Rahysa Vargas, who's a real estate attorney here in the South Florida area, who does a ton of transactions on the residential side and has a lot of experience, not just in the real estate space on doing buying and selling and transacting that way, but also in the legal space. I have understood that she's read 108 pages 30 minutes before getting here. No, she's actually been studying up on this since it announced. And so we wanted to bring to you the most up-to-date information that we have with a real estate attorney and a real estate agent. And I guess if we put our heads together, we'd kind of maybe make sense, right? Yeah. Okay, cool. So that's what the podcast is about. So if you're interested in that, make sure you like, subscribe, and do all that stuff. Stay tuned for more information. But Rahysa is more than just a real estate attorney. She's also my sister. And so she kind of had to do this podcast. We had your husband on the last, on one of the, I think my first Confidant podcast. So, you know, I guess my dad's next. I don't know. Well, somebody else is going to, in my family. Our dad, yeah. Anyways, so Rahysa, welcome to the podcast. How do you feel being the second guest of the Confidant podcast?
I'm excited.
Yeah. What are your expectations of this podcast?
Just have to real conversation about real estate.
Cool. Yeah. All right. Well, I hope I don't let you down. And so let's jump in, right? Yeah. Let's not waste our viewers' time anymore.
Exactly.
So real estate lawsuit, in a nutshell, what would you say for somebody who's never heard about this? But I feel like it affects so many people because everybody either is envisioning of one day buying a home or has a home and maybe is considering selling it. So real estate commission plays a big factor into the home purchasing process. Yeah. So this kind of affects a lot of people. Right. So if you were not in the real estate space at all and somebody is asked you, why is this so important? What would you say to them?
Yeah. So thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about this because like you said, I read 108 pages and annotated this to its core. But I've been following this really closely for a while because attorneys do that. They like watching cases develop. And so what happened was essentially there's a group of plaintiffs, right, that sued NAR, the National Association of Realtors. Primarily, obviously, the sellers were complaining that allegedly, and I'm going to say allegedly because, you know, there's a lot of misinformation as we're going to talk about in a little bit, that allegedly they were forced to pay for the seller was forced to pay for the buyer's agent commission and that amount was 3%. And the reason why I say allegedly, because everybody who's watching this that is a realtor knows that may have been customary, but it wasn't in fact ever required. And it was in fact something that could be negotiated. And we deal with hundreds and hundreds of transactions all the time. And they range from 1%, 2%, 2.5%, 3%.
Flat fees even.
Yeah. So they range in a whole realm of possibilities in terms of commission. So if you're watching, you're a realtor, you obviously know that watching the NAR litigation upset you because you're like, that's actually not true. It was never required. Now, something is to be customary. We're going to talk about why it was customary because obviously that's driving in a bunch of, I'm hitting this microphone a lot. I'm sorry, I'm getting really
passionate. You're passionate about this topic.
Aggressive and passionate about this.
Yeah. You want to save the buyer's commission.
I'm saving the realtors that are watching this. Call me. No, but really, you know, it was always something that was negotiated. And I think there was a lot of misconception because the sellers really here were an uninformed class. And what we're going to see is that there's great buyer's agent and then there's not so great buyer's agent. You know, maybe buyer's agents that only been agents for 20 days. There's nothing wrong with being an agent for 20 days, by the way. Let me just put that out there. But obviously things happen with experience. You know, I've been practicing for a long time now. And my year 5 to my year 9, totally different. You know what I mean? Like the amount of experience that you have in one area is going to increase with time. And so obviously these sellers who were in my view, they were not represented correctly, because a lot of them, they may not have had agents that were transparent as to how this happens. You know, like, why are you going to offer the 6%? Well, number one, you're probably going to get a lot more buyers through the door. And so I think that's really what happened. So obviously NAR entered into a settlement agreement. That's what we're talking about, what the changes are going to be. And then I say proposed changes a lot because in actuality, this is a proposed settlement agreement that is going to be, it's being proposed as what's actually going to happen. I think it is, because there's a lot of details that are into it that I think it is going to happen and be effective in mid-July. But that's what it is.
Okay. So a lot to unpack there. I think in this podcast, I think our goal collectively is to kind of talk about a couple things. Like, what does this mean to the layman, the buyer and the seller who, as you said, is not maybe well informed in the process, nor should they be, because they're not doing this on a day-to-day basis like you and I are doing. Also, how this is going to shape the real estate landscape. Clearly, that's going to be assumptions that you and I are going to give, because none of this has taken place, so we don't really know. Like I like to tell people, a lot of people thought the real estate landscape was going to change and actually crash with COVID, and we saw quite the contrary, right? So who's to say who anybody, if anyone is right? But I also think that people want to see who's going to get who comes out the winner in this and who comes out the loser in this. And I have my predictions and my assumptions, and I think that there is a lot of positives that could come out of this, and we can't negate that there's a lot of negatives that are definitely going to come out. And it's really going to depend on what side of the coin are you on, and some insights that maybe you should take into effect if you're a buyer, especially if you're a buyer, but also a seller. Okay, so the commission itself, let's talk about how it originated as 6%. Now, this is going to vary. I want to just preface this from market to market, because markets are so hyper local on the real estate that they sell. Nationally, this is going to be very different. There's some, as you know, flat fee brokers that charge you just a set fee. There's traditionally commission is 6% on some hotter markets, we can say. But for example, in Miami and Broward is very different. Miami usually charges 6% in commission for selling. And when I say 6%, guys, it's 6% of the total sales price.
3% each side.
Right, 3% each side. So the seller pays the 6%. They pay 3% to the agent representing them on the sale, which is the listing agent. And then they pay the 3% representation to the buyer, which is the selling agent. And usually that's 6% traditionally in Miami. But in Broward, it's 5%. So it's usually 2.5% to each side. Now, why is that important? What do you think? I mean, I have my assumptions as to why this became 6% and why it's been 6% for so long. But what do you think about it being 6% and how that can change in the future?
Or how it's going to change in the future?
Yeah, and who is going to really be affected by that?
Yeah, so, I'm going to go back to one point before I answer that question.
Sure.
I think that, number one, I see a lot of positives in this. I know that's going to sound a little crazy, because even in Miami-Dade Broward,
but you're an eternal optimist.
Agent, I am. That actually is very true. That is.
You see positives at anything.
I know. My husband always tells me that I see the glass half full all the time, and I live in a distorted reality, which could be true. But here's what I think. I think for those of you who have been doing this a long time, you're going to have a benefit, because we're going to drive out a lot of people that are doing this for fun. Like how you mentioned, like my aunt who works at the DMV and I got a real estate license. Those people are not going to last in this market, because there's a lot of things that you need to be good at in order to, change with times. Number one, you need to be good at your job, and so there's going to be a lot of transparency. But in terms of why, I think you can speak as to why it ever became 6%, because I think maybe the history of why it turned into 6% is more your category. But for me, one of the big changes, so this is obviously the biggest change, is that you can no longer list the commission, right? So the change is that you can't put it in the MLS. You can't list the 3%, whatever you're offering to the buyer's agent. So that's going to be the number one.
So you could still charge the 6%.
Yes.
You just cannot list it
on the MLS.
And let not buyers, but buyers agents know that what they're going to receive in selling the property.
And why that's important is because, to your points in another conversation we had, buyers agents can no longer be like, oh, I want to show only the ones that have 3%. I don't want to show the ones that offer 1%. They have to look at the best interest of their client and say, hey, let's go check out this house, because I think it fits all your needs.
Right.
And I'm going to have to figure out the commission.
Right. Instead of being biased to say it fits all your needs, but I'm not getting paid my full commission on this. So it's against my interest in showing you this property, which, to be fair, that is definitely something that some buyer agents would do.
Yeah.
And it may seem kind of scummy, and it definitely is when you're going to put your interest above your buyers, and you know, you're there supposedly to help them.
Right.
But at the same time, we have to understand that the majority of real estate agents sell one home a year.
Right.
So if you're going into selling one home a year and it's your only home, you're like, man, I need my 3% because I'm going to sell it at a discount.
No, and don't get me wrong. We have a lot of buyers that are difficult. So like, you know, I think buyers agents work extremely hard. In fact, sometimes I think that's a much harder job than being a listing agent because you're driving around the entire city showing 35 houses. So the bare minimum.
But also you're showing 35 houses to another thing on the NAR settlement, which is you're showing 35 houses, and the majority of buyer agents, especially the ones that are new, who maybe are not as experienced, do not have a buyer agent broker agreement. And so can you speak a little bit on why that's important in this settlement and what's changing with the buyer's broker agreement?
So the first thing is, I mentioned obviously the MLS is going to change, and both of these are going to tie in together. So the first thing is obviously it's going to change. You can't list it. But no one said that it can't be negotiated. So it's going to still be something that's going to be negotiated. And I think that's the part where people have a misconception. Like there's not going to be a commission. Buyer's agents are going to be gone. That's absolutely not true at all.
And buyer agents they still have the right to know what they're going to get paid, right?
Right.
It's not like they're just selling a home and praying that at the transaction table, like they just get paid something. But the way they go about finding out that information is different.
And in fact, because I'm super, you know, methodical and I like annotating different, you know, documents, I thought about every single possibility on how it'll still work for buyer's agents. I'm actually teaching a class on this. You can also email me and get the information, the notes on it.
You want to plug your class real quick, if in case? April 10th. Okay, cool.
Anyways, but in Miami.
Details will be in the show notes, guys, if you wanted to register.
If you wanted to get more information on every single possible way that I thought of on how you can still get your commission and how this is going to work out, there's a million ways that I can see this working. But the only thing they got rid of is you can't put in the MLS, okay? But there's still a million ways to find out about your commission, right? So you can still obviously call. You know, you can still figure this out and call. Your offers can also include how much you're offering to get your commission.
My offers usually always include how much I'm going to get paid on when I'm representing the buyer, even if it states on the MLS.
It's just also another thing in the way you say it. So I'm going to give a lot of notes in my class on how you actually put it, not just put in an amount. Like it needs to be an additional.
Yeah, it has to be a lot more
transparent. The key word on this is like everything needs to be transparent. So the amount that you're getting paid is going to be a lot more transparent. So that's one thing. But obviously I see brokers openings being a huge thing now because guess where everybody's going to announce
their information.
Yeah. Brokers open. So you're like, I want to bring my
brokers opens are going to be super full now because it's like, come today and find out what we're paying. It's
doing.
Like a raffle.
Here's another thing that I found out. Fun fact. The MLS, the NAR cannot specifically do a website showing everyone's commission, but you as a broker
could do your own website.
On your listings. I just want to caveat because this is not like everyone's listings are going to post up like what their commission. No, only specifically on your listings. But people can still look you up, you know, make it accessible, post it on your Instagram, post it on social media, like show what your commission is.
It's also fair to say that listing agents are still going to fight for the 6% because that's what works in the market. And guys, if you're watching this and you're saying, but we should be able to sell our property at this percentage and I don't want to pay that, you're definitely in your right to sell it at whatever percentage you're able to negotiate with your listing agent. But your listing agent is also in their right, not willing to take it. If they're like, hey, I want to sell it at 6%. This is what my time is worth to sell your property. I'm not willing to negotiate and come down to 5%. You can sell it with another agent who's willing to reduce their price. Similarly to how I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if I go to an attorney and they're like, hey, I'm $450 an hour for representation, and I'm like, can you do $350? And they're like, no, I just don't do $350 an hour. But there are other attorneys who do $350 an hour. I'm happy to present them to you, but just my time for what I know, how busy my schedule is, and how effective I am, that's what my rate is. And so 6% has been the standard. It's like attorneys charge whatever they want, and it could go as high as you want. You could charge $5,000 an hour, but 6% has always kind of been the ceiling. Yeah. It's like you don't ever really see more than that.
I think one thing we need to keep in mind is like buyer's agents are not going anywhere. People still need places to live. And the reality is the best negotiators are going to win this, you know? Yeah. And The truth of the matter is,
And
like,
listing agents aren't going to be showing buyers. So
yeah, and you need to continuously explain to your client, like, this is a reality. Miami is a very hot market, but like, if you're a buyer and you're thinking you're going to go buy the house on Zillow that you saw, it's gone. Like, by the time you have figured out the house, it is gone. So they're still going to need buyer representation. So there is still a market for that, and there always will be. It's just a matter of how you approach things. And as a listing agent, how you get creative and you explain, listen, 100%, we can offer 2.5, but just like concessions and just how like your listing price, like if you're not experienced in this business and you list a house for a certain amount, sometimes you see a house dropping $30,000
and it's
$100,000. Why? Because it was listed too high. The same thing's going to happen on commission. It's like, hey, if we don't offer anything,
there's no incentive to the buyer to bring somebody.
Exactly. Right? So I think the way that we do things is going to change a little bit, but the reality is we're still going to be doing it.
I agree. I think a lot of good could come out of this because transparency is always great in business. Right. And I think that buyer agents are going to have to show their value. Like, hey, 3% is what I'm supposed to get paid, or what I'm willing to work for, right, to get paid. Yeah. Whether it's the seller who pays me or you, the buyer who pays me, or it's a combination of the both. Maybe the seller only wants to pay me 1.5%. Then you're going to have to pay the other 1.5%. I think that it goes to show buyer agents are going to have to show their value and show exactly what it is that we do. And I think that's been missing in a lot of listing agents have that completely, encapsulated. When they go on a listing appointment, or when I'm sitting in front of a seller, we have this big presentation of like what we're doing, how many social media followers we have, what's the impact that we're doing, how many, brokers open houses, like, and how quickly are we assuming that we're going to sell your property or estimated to sell your property at what price, what's the process of strategy. All of that is kind of broken down in multiple conversations to get a listing. Buyer agents are just like, hey, you want to see a property? Let's go see properties, right? And then those conversations aren't really had. And I think that that's a missed opportunity for you to really sit down, educate your buyer, educate why they need to work with you. Yeah. And how we were alluding to earlier, I think a lot of buyers, two things are going to happen. Fly-by-night agents are going to basically be reduced. This is already a very difficult, highly competitive business. Selling one property a year is not sustainable. It doesn't work, but even less now, because now that one property that you're supposed to be selling, like 70 to 80% of agents sell one property a year. That property is going to be even harder to get because now you can't count on your cousin or your brother-in-law who's like, hey, let me just throw them a property to sell. Why? Because I think buyers are going to be more, and would you agree with this point? Buyers are going to have to be more intentional about who is going to represent me exactly. Because
so to your question that we just went off in 10 minutes ago, the second biggest change is that you now need a buyer's broker agreement. So we're going to go back to that. And I think that's the second biggest change in terms of what we do. Now, this may sound like a really big change in Miami, or I should say South Florida and Florida, because it's not traditionally used, but it's not in other states. Actually, there are a lot of states who already require this. So they're like looking at NAR like, okay, like this already happened, But for states like Florida and other places that require, or now never use it or now be required, they're going to have a buyer's rep agreement signed prior to going on any listings and showings.
Which is so great. I actually think it's
not a bad thing. I think it's great because here's the thing. I don't know how many of you, and if you're watching this, you know of a client, especially if you're in South Florida, you know of a client who shopped around agents. So they went on 17 different showings with 15 different agents, right? They were like, well, I just want to see who the best one is. And then they, to your point.
And then they spent the seller's money to pay for their agent because it's like completely free. As if the buyer was paying for the commission at the time. Right.
And so they waste a lot of people's time.
And resources,
and gas and time and all the things. So I think you're going to wean out these buyers. You're going to be like, okay, how serious is this person about buying a house? Because if they're willing, you can't go to a single showing. This is a new rule. A single showing
without
that agreement. So now you're like, oh, you want to watch? You just saw this house and you want to see it? Okay, wonderful. I need you to sign this. Like get it ready. DocuSign. Get it ready for in front of the house. Like getting them ready. Like
we can't open this lockbox
until you have signed this.
Now this buyer agent agreement. Is going to show, because some people may be asking, what does this buyer agent agreement really entail? If I'm a buyer in this market and I have to now sign this agreement, what am I signing? And from my understanding, unless they've changed it, right? Because I'm not sure if they're modifying it, is my understanding of what they're doing, but I don't know the particulars. Right. And so, but my understanding of it is that it sets, like you said, the transparency of what your buyer is going to be doing for you and how much commission your buyer is going to be making that you agree to. if the seller pays the buyer that commission, you pay the buyer nothing. But if the seller doesn't pay the buyer the commission, it's additional to your closing cost, and then you bridge the gap. So if the buyer agent agreement is 3%, for example, and the seller pays 2%, then you're paying 1% to bridge the difference, right?
Yeah.
But it could also be that, to be fair, we just have like the market could July may come, and the market may not change. They may not be listed on the MLS. Everybody's still collecting 6%. So when you call, they're like, we're giving you your normal 3%. Now we just have a bunch of buyer agents agreements out there. That's great for the buyer, right? Because now that person who signs is going to be, you'll know exactly if they're going to waste your time or not. Because if they're not willing to sign it, they're not signing a bunch of them. And if they do sign it, they're for real. And so, but then also you're still getting your 6%. So I think, or your 3%. So I think that if in that scenario, in that alternative universe, if it goes down that path, which it very may well be, it would be great for real estate. I think a lot of people will be weaned out. You work with more serious buyers, and the commission is still 3%.
Yeah. So on this buyer agreement, one of the things that I got to tell you what I like and do not like. So one thing is, I think that's great. Like, we're going to wean out. We're going to have real buyers. We're going to have a lot more transparency. We're going to have real people that are not wasting a bunch of my broker's time. But one thing I don't like is, like, obviously now it needs to be super ascertainable. It can't be like, okay, 2.5 unless the seller offers 3%. That's where we're going to, a lot of people need to make sure this is flushed out. So it needs to be ascertainable. What sucks about it, or that should not even be the word, but the part that I don't like about it is that if you put 2.5, you agreed with the buyer at 2.5, but the seller is offering 3%, you can't collect that 0.5%. That's the caveat.
But what if it's not 2.5? You just do 3%.
So here's what my suggestion is going to be, and you can check this out at the class. But my suggestion is going to be, you need to explain that in the event that the seller is offering, we're gonna start at 3%. I can't collect the 0.5%, so I need it to be 3%.
If it's again, goes back to transparency. If it's laid out that if this happens, then this is my commission.
Correct. Yeah. So it needs to be laid out from the very beginning, because you can't say I'm only offering 1%. I'm only gonna ask you to do 1%, and then try to think that you're collecting 3%. That's not gonna happen. So I think that part is, you have to make sure it's ascertainable. You can't do like some weird mathematical equation. You got to lay out, or unless you're doing a flat fee, then you're literally laying out like, okay, $20,000. That's what my fee is, or whatever the case may be if you're doing a flat fee. But here's what I do. And the one I'm specifically working on, I actually think is great, is some buyers are going to think that they can go around the whole system. And so what are they going to do? They're going to sign it, and then they're going to maybe potentially, I know in this world, I've been in this world for a while now, and I know in this world, some buyers may be like, well, you know what? Let me just offer behind the agent's back the offer. You know what I mean? Like, they went and they took me, they did all the stuff I wanted.
Yeah, but that could be happening right now.
Yeah. But we're making
and we're less protected now than in July,
before, right? So we're making sure, and I don't know if your broker is going to have this or not, but in the one that we are helping draft, having a clause that if you do that, you still are responsible for 2.5 or 3%, whatever they agreed on. So that's kind of important in terms of the change. But, I think it's going to secure a lot of things for a lot of buyers agents. In fact, maybe waste a little bit less of their time. And we're still going to find out, and people are still going to be offering commission. I mentioned this to you in another conversation, but, I was doing research, and it said that 50% of sellers that sold in 2023 gave concessions, right? And that's just going to look like they were either giving money for closing costs, right? They were giving monies, credits to the buyers. That's just going to look differently. It's going to be the commission. You know what I mean?
But there's a couple things there, right? When you look at that statistic and it says 50% of sellers, and this is nationwide, right? So this isn't just a Florida thing or a Miami thing. So commissions and concessions are very common in this practice. But what it tells me is that those are good buyer agents, right? Representing for their client, knowing how to negotiate, how to renegotiate, where to get credits on the inspection, where to get credits on the appraisal, how do you handle an appraisal? That's the value that a buyer adds, right? And so that's still going to have to take place with a buyer agent agreement. The only thing is, from my understanding, where it goes back to the beginning where I was telling you who really gets the short end of the stick. I think buyers get the short end of the stick here, because you cannot finance commission. No. So if you get a credit, right, for the house or whatever, your lender could finance the property or what have you, and then you could get that credit, and it could be part of your loan. If you negotiate it down, then it's still part of your loan or whatever it is. But you can't get a credit and then have the buyer lender finance your commission. That's just not going to happen. And so now, if what does this mean in terms of practically speaking? Well, if I'm a buyer's agent, and I'm here to try to negotiate your inspection to get you $10 or $20 or $50,000, but I have a choice between negotiating $20,000 for your inspection or negotiating $20,000 for my commission.
Yeah.
The seller only has so much to give. You know what I mean?
But remember, your negotiation should have happened with the offer. So you don't need to be
of course.
negotiating still, because the whole thing was they should have accepted your offer with the additional term that said your commission. So now if you're going into inspection, let's say, because average inspection here is 5 days, 5 to 7 days. I mean, we're talking about Florida. I don't know what it is around the state. But in Florida, we have very fast inspections. We've already passed that. They've already accepted the offer. Your commission was already listed on there. So remember, the additional term this conversation should have happened before the offer was accepted and with the offer. You need to make sure as a broker, you're being protected and that you're already negotiating that and the seller has already signed on your additional terms on the original contract, what your commission was going to be. And to be clear, this happens in a lot of states where commercial real estate is done this way. So it's already been negotiated. At closing, they feel the exact same way. I do some commercial real estate and it's handled this way. They've already negotiated the commission before you sat down at the closing table. I mean, when you got your offer accepted, they knew what the commission was going to be. So I think it's just a matter of retraining agents to understand that we're going to work and perform a lot more like the commercial real estate side, and we're going to get our offer accepted with the commission. And I think one of the selling points, like you have a perfectly good offer that you want to accept. You can sit here and waste. How much time is it going to take for you to waste and try to get another offer that's like going to close viably? Make it really competitive. Can you close faster? Can your buyer close faster? You're guaranteeing 20 days. How much money do you lose? What can you do to sell your offer with your commission and show why you need to get paid?
Yeah, there's also a lot of key points too, because I follow the noise, and there's definitely a lot of sellers who love this. They're like, yeah, finally agents are going to get paid what they deserve, which is not 3%. You guys are just glorified door openers or whatever it is. There's I mean, part of me agrees with that. I'm like, there's definitely some agents here that don't deserve.
Some listing agents that never show up.
Right. Some listing agents that never show up, or even some buyer agents are like, I showed the property, sent the offer. You got I'm sometimes reminding buyer agents like, hey, when are you sending the escrow letter? And they're like, oh, when am I supposed to send that? Or are we doing it? I'm like reminding buyers if they're going to do an inspection, like the benefits their buyer. And I'm like, I feel terrible if I just not have them a fair share. I think that everybody, this is what was agreed to on the contract. The seller agreed to it. Like, if you want to do so I feel like a lot of listing agents pick up the slack for buyer agents. I'm like, man, we're doing double the work and getting paid half, and they're getting paid the exact same amount, and I'm doing their work. So I definitely get where sellers are coming from in that sentiment, although that's not every buyer agent. Like you and me, we perfectly know buyer agents who work their ass off, and they are literally constantly putting in the time.
Or what I like to think about it is in Spanish, we have a saying that lo barato sale caro. And it's the reality is you think as a buyer, you're going to know what area to live in. Or do you live in a good area? What about if you're transplanting? You don't know the bad areas in Miami or South Florida or New York or wherever you're moving to, you don't know what area is good for your kid's school. You don't know whether or not it's a good investment. You don't know what the comps are. Yeah. You don't know who are you going to call
I like a saying to that, and not in Spanish for a non-Spanish speaking. I've always liked the saying that says, great service is expensive, bad service costs a fortune.
Right.
And it definitely goes to show that this is going to be, when the market is shifting, buyer agents and even realtors, we are adaptable. I would like to consider ourselves adaptable. This market is constantly shifting. We're in different cycles. You have to change. You have to switch hats. We're representing investors now. We're representing buyers. Are we in a seller market? What's going on? So the people who adapt are going to survive. The good ones are gonna be there. But I do want to make something super clear is that flat fee brokers have been around forever.
Yeah.
You've always had the ability to sell your property by yourself without any agents.
Right.
You could choose, if you're a seller, hey, I'm not going to use any listing agent, and I'm going to pay the buyer agent 1%, and I'm going to save 5%.
I mean, there's people that literally don't hire attorneys for
they'll do the whole thing. Yeah, it's they'll save all the money possible. But the reality of the situation is statistically proven, even though that's been true for decades now, for sale by owners still sell significantly less without a real estate agent. So even if you're trying to go out there and want to save the 5%, the 6%, what have you, and even want to do the title work, which would be insane because now you're basically doing like 3 full-time jobs. But whatever, if you wanted to do that, you still more than likely, statistically speaking, would not sell it for more and make more money. And this is factoring in those. So people made less money even after you factored in the commission that was paid. So I think that there's a ton of value. Going back to the transparency clause, it's like buyers and sellers are going to have to know the value that we give. And it's incumbent upon us to show that.
I love that you said that, because for me, one of the biggest things that I'm doing in training my agents is the mentality needs to shift. It's like, what are you providing? But also, what are the biggest hurdles that buyers have when they're buying a house on things that can go wrong? I've had buyers agents on the other side, like when I'm representing the seller in a transaction in my real estate closings, where the buyer's agent has lost the escrow deposit because they don't know, they don't care, they don't look at the inspection period. There's a lot of different nuances, but like as buyer's agents, we need to educate the public a lot. This is on social media platforms, on whatever platform you have, on your websites. I think your brokerage has to put it out, maybe on flyers, on your door. Why me? Like, why should you hire me as your buyer agent? Well, here's all the things you don't know, And so I think that there's a lot of that, like education. And I think still the reason why we even saw this lawsuit is because sellers were misinformed. Like they didn't have agents that were informing them. And I think a lot more has to come out. Like, why should you use a buyer's agent? Let's talk about transparency and all the things that can go wrong, So yes, we need to be on the cutting edge of like letting buyers know why they need representation. Same thing like when I see title companies, no offense to title companies out there that don't have an attorney, but like, why are attorneys important on conveying property? Do you want as a buyer to buy a house where the person who saw it, who drafted your documents for fulano de tal and never checked title? Like, you know what I mean? Like
it's owned by 5 different people.
Yeah, it's owned by 5 people. It was in foreclosure, there's bankruptcy, they got divorced,
there's
the wife
liens
didn't
on
sign,
it,
like,
and you have no idea.
Like estate and probate
Which, by the way,
issues.
people, when we say that, they're like, "Oh, that will never happen." We've had that happen where people have claimed, like, "I own this property. I don't know why you're selling it to this person."
Yes, I literally do that for a living and fix a lot of these issues. Yeah, it really does happen. And there's so much litigation on bad title and stuff, but that's a different
this is different podcast.
But my point is that that's still what we need to educate people on. Why? The reason why they should hire me, the reason why they should hire a buyer's agent. So what are the things that they're going to miss if they don't, and why it's so important? I mean, do you know anything about all the HOA, like
special assessments?
Yeah. What about the property disclosure? What if this house has been flooded 15 times? Do you know anything about that?
Paint disclosure, all these things. Now, here's a question that we could try to cast iron pipes for sure. Nightmare. Not knowing that could cost you a fortune for sure. Now here's a question that I want to see if you could put to bed, because if you've been following the clamor on social media, sellers are like, "Oh, well, attorneys will just do the buyer. Like, we don't need a buyer agent. Attorney would do that." And a lot of attorneys, seasoned title companies, are like, "Dude, we will not be showing up for inspections. We will not be showing up for appraisals. Like, these are just things that we don't do. Like, we work hand in hand with the buyer agent. They are just as much involved and needed as we are in this transaction." Do you agree with that? Or do you think like, no, attorneys will evolve to basically fill in that need for buyers?
Yeah, God. There's a lot of title companies that I don't feel the need for anything. So I can't imagine.
Not even the title need.
Yeah, they don't feel.
They don't fill the title need, let alone the buyer's need.
That's number one. That's for a separate podcast. But let alone being buyer represent. They don't even represent their clients on the legality of things because they don't know. So imagine on the side that they're not even experienced with. I think we come from a family that this is like, we talk about this all day. We know both sides kind of. But I don't know. I mean, I think there's buyers that are always going to be able to negotiate contracts. That part for sure. But there's a lot of nuances that are going to happen. I don't know, like 17 inspectors, what did they check? Let me look at the inspection report. Let me negotiate down things. Like, can I negotiate things for you? 100%. But is it recommended that like somebody goes to your inspection and you see whether or not they actually inspected the house? Because most of the great buyer agents that I know go with the inspector. And no offense, you'd have to pay me to go to your inspection and spend 3 hours, because if they're doing a 30-minute inspection, there's a problem. But like, to do a thorough inspection. And why do you want to pay me to sit around in your house, in like potential new house, to figure out whether or not this guy climbed on the roof and checked your shingles?
Yeah, and buyers were doing that free of charge to the buyer buyer agents were doing that free of charge to the buyer.
With the hopes that
With
it
the
would
hopes that they would
close.
close, because sometimes that's a key point. If you pay an attorney to do it, they're going to charge you $500 an hour. And whether the property closes or not, they're getting paid. Buyers would just be like, I pray this closes.
Yeah.
And good buyer agents would be like, and even if the inspection comes back bad, I'm willing for my client to cancel this deal because it doesn't benefit them and lose my time here and then show them another property because I care about the transaction. I care about this relationship.
Yeah.
It's not a very transactional thing. So I agree. There could be a lot of good stuff that comes with it, and I think because you and I are eternal optimists, we're always going to think that, like, yeah, and we love change and it's like more market share, you know, like we constantly think like that, but we're entrepreneurial, we're competitive, but not everyone's like that.
No.
So if we're thinking about what are the bad things that can happen, what are you just thinking, like, how can this be detrimental to both agents, sellers, and buyers?
Well, yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier that it's definitely a lose situation for the buyer because if the buyer doesn't have cash to close, are we changing the amounts that they can afford in a house? Does this mean that they're going to have to, you know,
choose one over the other in some cases?
So in terms of, do they have enough cash to close, you know? Because
in an already super expensive market, they're like, man, I got to think of potentially paying.
So I think that could be potentially what I think. But here's what I do think. Here's my eternal optimistic point coming back.
You can't even think negative for like 2 seconds. Your eternal optimist is like,
because I think that the mortgage industry is well aware of this. Just like the real estate industry, just like the title world, just like the attorneys are reading this. They got to shift. You know, like banks got to shift and be like, all right, listen, this whole thing shift, cataclysmic, like change, you know, even though I don't even think it's as big of a change as we're making it, but in terms of like the change, what are lenders going to be offering? You know, like, are you going to now cover 100% of the cost for closing? Because there's another aspect of the fact that they need, even though we're going to put on the contract, down payment, escrow to payment number 1 or escrow to payment number 2, all that money needs to go into like now the commission. Now I need you to finance 100% because this money just went to the commission. You see what I'm saying? Like, what are they going to do?
Yeah, because lenders are still going to want to loan money. They don't want to just be like, oh, well, I guess buyers can't buy now.
Buyers can't buy. So like, let's just not make
the
money
3% or the 5% down plus the 3% for the buyer, they don't have it. Like, they're going to have to figure something out.
So I'm waiting to see what program, because you think people in the bank industry are not trying to figure something out. In the banking industry, what program are they going to be offering about this? If they were genius, they're going to be offering something on commission. Something needs to totally drastically change in a bank. And whoever is doing that first is going to get a whole lot more market share on this. So like the number one question I had while I'm thinking at night, because somehow this is intriguing to me, is like, what bank is going to offer to finance commission? Because that's going to be the next thing. The second thing I think about is I think we're thinking and anticipating that a bunch of seller agents are going to be like, you know what, you're right. We should offer 0% commission at this. When is that going to happen? I don't think that's going to happen. You know, like, I don't think that anyone.
Yeah, as if listing agents were just getting an extra 3% commission for the kindness of their heart because they wanted to pay other agents. You know, they were getting the 3% for the other side and 3% for them side because they're trying to sell it as quickly as possible.
You know what's going to happen? Whoever does that first and thinks that they're not going to offer commission, that house is sitting there for 365 days on an MLS. Okay, so we're going to see. You know, in Miami, we see houses sometimes 10 days, 5 days, offers before, you know, like they even put, like anyone even did an open house,
over market at 6% commission.
So if you think that you're going to offer nothing, prepare for the house to sit there. So you have to come in as a listing agent and be like, listen, I love that you think there's a huge change in the market, but let me just tell you, there is. But you ain't selling this house.
Right.
So like you
really, or there is, but the change is I just can't tell the buyer agent how much he's going to get paid, but he could just call me.
Right. And maybe the negotiation is going to be like, cool, you only want to offer 2.5%, but maybe the buyer's agent's like, okay, you're responsible for 0.5%, which already happened for all the states that had broker agreements. That already happened. That didn't change. So it was like, okay, the seller's going to offer 2.5%. Congratulations. The buyer is not going to pay the 0.5%, which is a drastic difference. And the buyer's like, I don't want to lose this house for 0.5%. I'm just going to finance more money. And so I think there's going to be a shift in the way you got to think about it, but the reality, and get creative and really inform your seller on what's happening. But in terms of transparency, I think it's even going to help a lot of the seller's agents and a lot of it, because now your client trusts you, because this conversation had to be had. You know what I mean? So I think there's going to be a lot of like, hey, I trust you, because if you don't do it, we're going to be sitting there for 60 days. So let's offer at a bare minimum 2.5% and see if they're willing. If we don't see anything happen at 2.5%, okay, congratulations. Now we need to offer 3%. And so instead of seeing a drastic change in terms of price, remember when people are dropping 30, 40, 50, $100,000 off the market price, they're going to be changing the commission and it's not going to be listed. But what are you doing now? I actually think one drastic change is going to be actually for the seller agents. And no one's talked about this, but how you market your property to sell is also going to change. Are you getting creative? Are you doing it in your videos? Are you doing a lot more brokers open? Are you like sending out, because you now, who is your clients? It's not just a buyers. It's going to be buyers agents. So you know what I mean? Like as a seller's listing agent, you need to market yourself to buyers agents, getting people in. So brokers talk. If you're in a really big brokerage, everybody knows, hey, did you see a house last week and so, do you know whether or not they're offering? That's already going to happen. And internally, brokers can do all their commissioning and listing agents. So if you're smart and you have a lot of brokers, you have over 100, you have over 50 brokers, guess what you're going to be doing? Posting all of your listing agents' commissions. So all of them are going to try to sell each other's houses. So there's going to be a little bit of a shift, I think. But I think it's just a matter of if you're good at this job, it's still profitable.
Okay. Well, thank you for asking my question on how this could go bad with a optimistic standpoint. I think that's great. I think that's very helpful to the buyers out there. No, I agree. Overall, I think there's been a lot of talk because it's.
I want to give people hope.
Yeah. Well, that's great. They've come to the right podcast for hope. So yeah, like I mentioned, I think that there's a lot of changes that are happening, but I do think that they're made out to be bigger than they potentially are.
What do you think?
Maybe you and I are just optimistic. I find a lot of good things that are going to come out of this. There are going to be some negatives,
I mean, there's going to be buyer agents that only sell one house. That's going to be a problem.
Right. But there are going to be negatives. I think the negatives are going to shift because there are negatives in the way we do things now. Right. So the negative, like I've always said, is like, man, depending on the buyer agent that you choose, which really before wasn't given a lot of thought, that person is probably going to be like, man, I really need this deal.
It was free. They're like, let's just pick anybody.
And that was a pitch for a lot of buyer agents. It's like, hey, my services to you are free.
Yeah.
Which technically isn't true because somebody, and now you can't say that. And so
unless it's actually true. Like you can only say that it's free if you're literally charging the buyer nothing, which is sad. You can't say that at all. But
then you can't have a buyer agreement because it says that.
Right. That's what I'm saying. That is like one of the changes.
It's kind of like a catch-22. But I don't know if it's going to be bad. I just think it's going to be different. I mean, like people ask me, are we in a bad market? I'm like, depending on who you ask. When it's a seller's market, it's bad for one side of the, So it just really depends on who you represent. If you're an agent and you represent a ton of buyers in the seller's market, it's probably going to be a very difficult market for you, but vice versa, So I think it's just adapting. What I think probably will happen is there's going to be a lot of consulting that comes out of this where buyer agents are going to be like, listen, you want to go not have to worry about paying me in case the seller doesn't want to pay. Let's just say the seller's like, I'm not paying anybody 6%, 3% of my listing agent. You buyers figure it out. There's going to be a need for consulting because people are going to be like, listen, I can't pay you 2 or 3%. Right.
Flat fees.
Right. Flat fees. But a flat fee still requires you to go out and do certain work. And some agents are probably going to be like, listen, I'll consult. We can have Zoom conversations. I can review contracts for you if you want, but I'm not going out to an inspection. I'm not going out to an appraisal. You have 2 calls with me. Call me when the offer gets accepted. I'm happy to guide you through the negotiation process of what I would do if I were in your shoes representing you. And that's going to be a certain amount, for X amount of visitation. I think that that's probably going to happen because some people are just going to be like, I'm a buyer agent and I'm not willing to get paid less than 3%. But I still got to make money. And so maybe consulting is probably in the works. Some people haven't said that opinion, but I've just kind of been thinking, like you, I wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and I just think to myself, I'm like, if we had to get out of this, what would happen? So,
entrepreneur mindset.
Yeah. So how can we pick up market share? And then when markets are shifting, when they're changing, when they're bad markets, that's where a lot of companies are made.
Yeah.
But with that said, final thoughts on this. Do you think if you had to advise anybody out there who has a lot of anxiety going into this, I know you wanted to spread a message of hope, so the camera's on you. Any final thoughts that you wanted to add or anything on the 108 pages that we didn't talk about today that you're like, bro, we have to touch on this?
Yeah, I listen, I think, Obviously, because I think a lot of realtors were also let down as to why they even went into the settlement. They feel like they weren't represented. I guess this is like going to be a conversation.
Do you
for another
think?
day.
Do you think we were represented?
Listen, unlike the Harvey Specter
Well,
world
you're
of
not
suits,
a realtor, so you're not part of the National Association of Realtors.
You're right. I'm not part of the National
But it does
Association.
affect you. So do you think
100%.
realtors were
And
represented?
listen, if I thought like that, it could affect me negatively too. But I think the reality is, as entrepreneurs, as self-employed, because that's what everybody is. It's a realtor, right? You have to get creative. The market shifts, you shift. You got to figure out who your new target audience, how you're going to find them, how you need to speak to buyers. Are you getting on TikTok? Are you telling them why they need an agent? Like, what can go wrong? Can
You're
share
doing a
horror stories?
podcast
Like,
talking about
what are
somebody
you
who
doing?
read.
Like you need to figure out how you're going to get that market share. Because guess what? In another world, I also think there's a lot of buyers agents that are leaving. So the floor is yours.
Oh, there's been a ton already just with this news and even before the news.
That there's going to be a shift. And as brokers, we need to find partners that are going to help us make sure that our agents are well informed and know how to communicate and make sure they're filling all these guidelines. So partner up with like a law firm that knows a law, maybe not a title company that doesn't, that isn't researching and reviewing the law. I'm a little biased. I think there's a lot to say about title companies.
Yeah. You're gonna get a lot of hate from title companies in the comment section.
Sorry. Listen, title companies need to make money too, but I feel like there's some great ones out there. Don't get me wrong. But really, essentially, the law.
Know who you're working with. Yeah,
know who you're working with. And this is a whole thing. This whole thing came down because people were like, "How did they lose?" It really is a question of how the law works. And if you don't really understand that, you're really not going to understand what happened. And if you're not really reviewing 108 pages, you're really not going to know how to, make sure that you're complying with it. And if you don't know if you're affected or if you're part of the class that is part of the settlement, you don't even know whether or not you're allowed to still practice real estate, So there is a lot of that you need to know. I think, obviously, you guys can contact me. We'll drop the email, right?
Yeah, we'll put it in the description.
We'll put the email, but I do think that for those who work really hard and can get creative and are marketing correctly,
they're not going to miss a step. Yeah,
no,
everything is going to be business as usual.
We're just going to change into the way that commercial real estate is handled in a lot of places.
Which is doing terrible right now. Multifamily is just
but I'm talking about.
But the system,
You're talking about commercial real estate being sold, and that's because
I'm talking about the market itself.
I'm talking about the way business is conducted.
Yeah, of course.
And that's the shift, and we're gonna move into
a more commercial real estate type of system.
Exactly. So just a system, but obviously, yes, commercial real estate is not
doing
a lot
as
well
sectors.
as residential. But I will say that the market. I mean, if you're doing commercial real estate right now, you're like, what's changed?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like they're like, cool. This has been how it's always been.
Right.
And are they getting commission? I've never done a commercial deal where they're not getting commission. In fact, all of them are getting commission. That's
they know the value of it, but it's just handled differently.
Right.
It's negotiated. So, anyways, to sign off on this, because I think that there's probably a ton of questions, and if you guys want us to do a part 2 with Rahysa, we're more than happy to. And if you guys have any questions in particular, leave them in the comment section below, and that way Rahysa and I can answer them either on another, maybe a live or some sort of other podcast that we could do. But one thing I do want to say just to sign off is the losers could be who we've discussed, but the winners by far are the attorneys who represented this class action lawsuit.
God.
They came out winning, talking, rallying on us about 3%, and they're getting like 30 to 40% of the settlement.
I do agree. I actually do agree with the same because like the attorney. I mean, I wish I would have represented.
I know, but how much are they getting out of the settlement?
I mean, I actually didn't
like
read that
30 to 40%, and they're arguing over our 3%. Now, people will say, but they went to law school for like 4 years or whatever.
Let me just add something though, because I will say there's a misconception on this, and I do agree with you. I think that it's kind of crazy that you're arguing like so the seller first off, the class is getting pennies. Okay,
that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
All the sellers are getting pennies. I don't know how much you're gonna get, but like
my point is the hypocrisy of saying you guys abuse these people. Let us abuse these people with you. Like I just think it's crazy.
They're getting nothing for this whole thing. I mean, what they got is change. Although I will say, I also like research what could have happened if they didn't go into settlement. And I think a lot of people haven't spoken about that. But had they not gone into a settlement, it would have been disaster.
Really? Okay? Why so?
Because a judge in Missouri would have been the one that determined how this was going to work. And imagine somebody that doesn't know anything about real estate.
Making decisions on
how the entire nation was going to sell their houses. I think that would have
maybe
been
it's like
2%
2% should be the ceiling. Yeah.
And the reason why NAR was up against the wall to go into a settlement agreement, because I wanted to know, like, did they not get represented? Like, what happened?
Yeah, why aren't they going on appeal? All these things.
Exactly. Is they would have maybe, no, for certain,
They
they
would
would
have
have gotten
They would have
bankrupt. And no class besides NAR would have gotten out of the lawsuit, right? So that means Association of Realtors, all of MLSs, because they got a lot of people out. Because like there is a huge class that got out in that settlement, right?
Yeah, but a lot of brokers are paying for it. Compass has agreed to pay, I don't know how many millions. Keller Williams have. So like the NAR settlement, whatever. That's a whole other video. But yeah, that's part two.
But no, but I'm saying they would have not, if they would have gone bankrupt, they could have
It could have been worse. Yeah.
A bunch of people.
Worse,
and then what would we have seen is potentially other smaller brokers also go.
No, I agree that NAR, and I don't know too much of the details, but I'm thinking like if this is the way it happened, I'm sure they explored every other alternative before they got to the settlement.
Before everybody goes and kills
but
the attorney that
wasn't the point of what I said. The point of what I said was to point out the hypocrisy of the attorneys representing the plaintiffs on this settlement or class action lawsuit.
I guess that guy's
arguing
gonna
our point.
retire now at this point. You know
I mean, I would.
Like, he found this class and he's like, "How many of you are upset? 3 upset?" And they're like,
the guy sold more houses in one transaction than all us realtors. Basically,
for the record, in case you see this, I'm sorry, I have nothing against you, but I'm just saying it is kind of crazy.
Yeah, no, he's definitely gonna see my this video for sure. He's definitely gonna see the views that this podcast is gonna get is insane. Anyways, guys,
get the amount of the settlement.
Yeah, enough hubris for this podcast. But if you guys liked today's show and you enjoyed our guest, make sure you leave your love in the comment section below. We're also going to put Rhysa's dates in the description because she's going to be going a lot more in depth than this podcast. We barely scratched the surface. There's a lot of nuances, and we don't want to bore you. But if you go there, it's probably because you're really interested in finding out more. So we'll leave those dates. Is there anything else that you wanted to pitch? A book tour, a comedy special, anything that you want to just know?
So April 10th, I am going to do this free class. It's free for any broker that's interested in finding out more. I'm also, you can shoot me an email. So rvargas at vargaslaw, P as in purple, .com. So rvargas at vargaslawpa.com. And then I'll send you all the material and information. You'd schedule a call and I can give you the additional language you should do when you're actually trying to do negotiate the commission. I'm happy to give you guys all the additional resources that I'm putting out there. And if you're a small broker and you don't have these listing agreements, I'm happy to also provide that for free.
Yeah, brokers reach out, and if you are a seller or a buyer looking to transact and sell your property, Rahysa can get you. Her team is phenomenal. Obviously, they do all of my closings. Not like I have a choice, but no, regardless, I don't have a choice, but she crushes it. And then you also do like quick claim deeds and things of that nature. So anything like transacting wise that you have questions on and you're looking for somebody in the Miami, South Florida area, reach out to Rahysa. Other than that, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell for more podcasts like this, and check out my playlist on property tours. And with that said, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you on the next one.